There's a specific kind of silence that falls over Washington when something irreversible happens, a stillness that stands in sharp contrast to the noise and chaos that usually defines this town. You have likely seen the footage by now. It has been played on a loop on every major network, analyzed by pundits, and shared across social media platforms millions of times in just the last few hours. The Senate leader walking to the desk, the deliberate pause, the stroke of the pen on the document labeled the removal order. On the surface, it looks like a simple administrative act, the kind of bureaucratic theater we see every day on Capitol Hill. But I want to stop you right there, because if you look at that signature and see only a formality, you are missing the profound shift that just occurred beneath the surface of our democracy. What you witnessed was not just a signature. It was the final mechanical click of a constitutional lock snapping into place. For months, the conversation in this city has been dominated by speculation, by legal theories, by the loud back and forth of cable news debates about whether this day would actually come. We heard assurances from legal teams, confident predictions from political strategists, and endless spin from surrogates on both sides. But the moment that ink dried on the parchment, all of that noise evaporated. We moved instantly from the realm of political possibility into the cold, hard territory of administrative execution. I want to walk you through what this actually means, not just for the former president, but for the machinery of the government that you interact with and rely on. When we talk about power in Washington, we often talk about it in abstract terms: influence, leverage, optics. But power is also physical. It is codified in documents, in orders, and in signatures that compel agencies to act. The document the Senate leader just signed is effectively a self-executing instruction to the federal bureaucracy. It is the legislative branch telling the executive branch that a specific individual no longer holds the privileges and protections of the office. This is rare. In fact, we are in uncharted waters here. Usually, transitions of power are ceremonial, guided by tradition and mutual agreement. This is a forced extraction of authority authorized by the highest legislative body in the land, and it triggers a cascade of automatic protocols that most people do not even know exist. You might be wondering why this specific signature matters so much more than the vote itself. The vote was the decision. The signature is the command. Until that document was signed and sealed, there was still a theoretical gasp of air, a tiny window where legal maneuvers or procedural delays could have been attempted. That window is now closed. For Donald Trump, the shift in reality is immediate and jarring. We are hearing reports from sources close to the former president that the atmosphere at his residence is somber, almost silent. You have to understand the psychology at play here. For a man who has built his entire career and political persona on the idea of invincibility, on the premise that there is always another deal to be made or another court to appeal to, this is a confrontational moment. His legal team, the people he pays to protect him, had reportedly assured him that the process would stall, that the political will in the Senate would fracture, or that the paperwork would simply get lost in the gridlock of partisanship. That advice has turned out to be catastrophically wrong. The system, which often moves at a glacial pace, suddenly moved with striking efficiency. This creates a fascinating and volatile dynamic. You have a figure who is used to bending reality to his will, now facing a bureaucratic wall that does not care about rallies, poll numbers, or social media posts. The removal order is blind to popularity. It cares only about the statute. I think it is important for us to pause and consider how this affects you. It is easy to look at this as a clash of titans, a drama played out by wealthy and powerful men in marble buildings that have nothing to do with your daily life. But the stability of our government relies entirely on the orderly transfer and maintenance of power. When that process is disrupted, or when it requires this level of intervention to resolve, it sends a tremor through the entire system. The agencies that are now receiving this signed order are the same ones that handle national security, finance, and justice. They are now tasked with the unprecedented job of decoupling a former leader from the apparatus of the state. This is not just about one man leaving a stage. It is about stress testing the institutions that are supposed to serve you. If the gears grind too hard, if the friction is too great, it slows down everything else. We are watching the system correct itself in real time, and that is a messy, high-stakes process. Let's dig a little deeper into the mechanics of what happened in that room. The Senate leader did not just sign a piece of paper, he authenticated a verdict. In the architecture of our government, the Senate acts as a court of impeachment and removal in these specific scenarios. When they sit in judgment, they are not just legislators, they are jurors. The signature is the foreman handing over the verdict form, What is striking to me, speaking to people who were in the room, was the lack of fanfare. There were no speeches. There was no banging of the gavel to silence a rowdy crowd. It was done with a quiet, almost clinical precision. This was likely by design. The leadership understands that the country is on edge. They know that you are watching, perhaps with anxiety, perhaps with relief, but certainly with intense attention. They wanted to project stability. They wanted the visual language of this moment to be one of routine governance, even though the action itself is anything but routine. By stripping away the theatrics, they stripped away some of the oxygen that fuels political firestorms. They made it look like paperwork. And in Washington, paperwork is often where the real power resides. Now, we need to talk about the immediate consequences. You heard the prompt mention that this order is being rushed to appropriate agencies. This is not a figure of speech. There are couriers involved. There are chains of custody. This document has to be physically presented to key officials, likely the Secretary of State, the archivist, and the heads of federal law enforcement agencies. Once they receive it, they are legally bound to update their records and their protocols. It means that access passes are deactivated. It means that security clearances are reviewed or revoked. It means that the flow of classified information, which is often extended to former presidents as a courtesy, is reevaluated under the strict terms of this new order. We are talking about the physical dismantling of a presidency's afterlife. For you as a taxpayer, this is the system functioning as the ultimate check. It is the mechanism saying that no individual is bigger than the office they hold, and certainly not bigger than the law that created that office. We are going to explore the background of this in more detail, but I want you to sit with the gravity of this image for a moment. The Senate leader, a figure who has navigated decades of partisan warfare, putting his name on the line. It is a signature that will define his legacy just as much as it defines the former president's future. It is a moment where political calculation had to yield to constitutional duty, at least on paper. And for the viewer watching at home, wondering if the system is broken or if it can still work, this signature is a data point. It is evidence that the gears can still turn, that the brakes can still be pulled, even if the train is moving at full speed. But as we know, in politics, every action has an equal and opposite reaction. The signing is the end of one chapter, but it is the aggressive beginning of the next. The legal battles may be over in the Senate, but the battle for the narrative, for the history books, and for the minds of voters like you is only just accelerating. We need to understand how we got to this breaking point to understand where the pieces are going to fall next. To understand the weight of this document, we have to strip away the political shorthand we usually use. We often hear the phrase checks and balances tossed around in civics classes or cable news segments until it loses its meaning. But the removal order is the ultimate check. It is the emergency brake of the republic. In normal times, the Senate passes bills that sit on the president's desk waiting for a signature or a veto. It is a negotiation. This is different. This order does not ask for the president's permission. It overrides his existence in the executive structure. It is a unilateral assertion of legislative supremacy that our founders designed for a worst-case scenario. When I talk to constitutional scholars about this, they often describe it as a self-actuating instrument. That means it doesn't need the Department of Justice to validate it. It doesn't need the Supreme Court to weigh in on a specific clause today. The power resides entirely in the Senate's verdict, and the Senate leader's signature is simply the certification that the verdict was valid. It is the final stamp on a process that is designed to be difficult, almost impossible to complete. And yet, here we are. This brings us to the question of how we arrived at this precipice. You don't get to a removal order overnight. This was not a sudden spasm of partisan anger, despite what the former president's defenders are saying on social media right now. If you have been following my reporting over the last year, you know that this has been a slow, grinding accumulation of institutional friction. We saw the warning signs. We saw the initial investigations that were dismissed as witch hunts. We saw the subpoenas that were ignored, the executive privilege claims that were stretched to their breaking point. There was a belief inside the West House, and I heard this from multiple senior staffers at the time, that the Senate would never actually pull the trigger. They believed that the political cost of removal would always be higher than the cost of inaction. They calculated that the sheer polarization of the electorate would act as a shield, that no senator would dare cross the aisle for fear of a primary challenge. That calculation held for a long time. It held right up until the moment it didn't. What changed? Based on my conversations with key figures on the Hill, the turning point wasn't one single explosive headline, but a realization among the Senate leadership that the institution itself was being hollowed out. There is a sense of self-preservation in the Senate that often supersedes party loyalty when pushed to the extreme. When the executive branch began to systematically dismantle the oversight mechanisms, refusing to share data, blocking testimony, effectively ruling by decree. It forced the hand of lawmakers who previously were content to look the other way. You have to remember, these are people who view themselves as the guardians of the Article 1 powers. When they felt that their constitutional authority was being rendered obsolete, the mood shifted. It went from a political squabble to a turf war over the future of governance. The crisis that led to this vote was framed by the prosecution not just as a violation of law, but as a violation of the trust that allows the government to function. This is where it connects to you. You might look at this and see a feud between elites, but the breakdown of these norms has a direct cost on your life. When the machinery of government is consumed by a survival struggle like this, everything else stops. The infrastructure bill you were promised, stalled. The adjustments to healthcare policy, frozen. The diplomatic appointments needed to manage global crises, on hold. For the last 6 months, Washington has been paralyzed by this singular drama. Your tax dollars have been funding a government that has been essentially non-operational because its two co-equal branches were locked in a death grip. This removal order, in a very practical sense, is an attempt to unclog the drain. It is an attempt to reset the baseline so that the actual work of governing can resume. Whether you agree with the verdict or not, the signing of this order signals an end to the paralysis. It forces a resolution. We also need to look at the jurors in this case, the senators themselves. I watched them closely during the proceedings. In a normal legislative session, they are checking their phones, whispering to aides, or stepping out for fundraising calls. During the final deliberations for this order, the floor was silent. They understood that they were writing a chapter of history that would be taught 50, 100 years from now. I spoke with one senator from a swing state who told me, on background, that the decision to vote for removal was the hardest of his career. He knew it might cost him his seat. He knew it would alienate a massive block of his base. But he also said that the evidence presented behind closed doors, evidence that we in the media have only seen fragments of, was undeniable. This is a crucial point that often gets lost in the shouting. There is a gap between the public narrative and the private reality in Washington. The public narrative is about loyalty and deep state conspiracies. The private reality, the one that drove that pen across the paper, is about specific documented actions that crossed a red line. The process that led to this signature was grueling. It involved weeks of closed-door depositions, thousands of pages of documents, and intense negotiation over the rules of the trial itself. We saw the former president's legal team try every procedural trick in the book to delay the vote. They filed motions to dismiss. They challenged the constitutionality of the proceedings. They even tried to disqualify specific senators. But the Senate leader, a master tactician who has seen every play in the book, kept the train on the tracks. He kept the caucus unified enough to move forward, often by making concessions that we are only just now learning about. There were late-night meetings in the Capitol basement where the language of this very order was hammered out. Every word was scrutinized. They knew that if there was a single ambiguity, a single loophole, the former president's team would exploit it to cling to power. The document signed tonight is bulletproof because it had to be. It was written not just by lawyers, but by survivalists who knew they had one shot to get this right. So, what happens to the man at the center of this storm? Donald Trump has always thrived on chaos. He has always managed to turn victimhood into a weapon. But a removal order is a different beast. It strips away the bully pulpit. It removes the seal of the president from the podium. When he speaks now, he speaks as a private citizen, albeit a powerful one. The psychological blow of this cannot be overstated. I have covered him for years, and the one thing he fears more than anything else is being branded a loser. Not in an election, which can be spun as rigged, but in a constitutional judgment that says, definitively, you are unfit. This order is a permanent stain. It is a firing letter from the American people, delivered by their representatives. And unlike a tweet or a campaign rally, he cannot talk over it. He cannot interrupt it. He has to live with it. As we move into the next phase of this script, we need to examine the specific mechanisms that are triggering right now, the actual physical decoupling of the man from the state and who is responsible for enforcing it. Because the signature is just the start, the enforcement is where the real tension lies. Let's talk about that enforcement because it is happening in ways that are invisible to the cameras outside, but are earth-shattering inside the perimeter. The most immediate and tangible shift involves the military aide who carries the football, the briefcase containing the nuclear launch codes. For the entire duration of a presidency, that aide is a shadow, never more than a few feet away from the commander-in-chief. I have been told by sources familiar with national security protocols that within minutes of the Senate leader's signature being authenticated, a secure order was transmitted to the Pentagon. The codes assigned to Donald Trump were effectively zeroed out. The aide currently stationed with him was instructed to stand down and secure the equipment until a handover could be facilitated. It is a chilling, quiet moment of disconnection. 1 minute you have the theoretical power to end the world. The next, you are simply a civilian standing in a room with a briefcase you can no longer open. This is the mechanism of the state protecting itself. The system is designed to ensure that there is never a millisecond of ambiguity about who holds the sword. When that removal order was signed, the chain of command snapped the link to the former president and instantly rerouted to the acting authority. It is brutal, efficient, and entirely necessary to prevent any confusion that adversaries might try to exploit. Inside the West Wing, the scene is reportedly chaotic but driven by a grim bureaucratic necessity. You might imagine people running down hallways with boxes, and there is some of that, but the real action is digital. The White House Communications Agency, or WHCA, manages the secure lines and the digital infrastructure of the presidency. Their checklist for a removal event is extensive. Access to classified servers is being terminated user by user. The secure phones that allow the president to communicate with world leaders are being remotely disconnected or rerouted. I spoke to a former senior administration official who described this process as going dark. The goal is to prevent any midnight orders, rash decisions, or directives issued in the heat of the moment that could complicate the transition or damage national interests. The staff knows this. They know that their badges, which worked this morning to get them through the Northwest Gate, will likely flash red by midnight. This creates a frantic atmosphere where people are not just packing up personal items, they are trying to download archives, save emails, and secure their own legal standing before the lights virtually go out. We also have to look at the Secret Service. Their mission has fundamentally changed in the last hour. They are no longer protecting the president, they are protecting a former president. That might sound like semantics, but legally and operationally, it is a massive downgrade. The size of the detail shrinks. The assets available to them, the motorcades, the advanced surveillance, the preemptive sweeps, are scaled back to what is statutorily required for a past leader. The bubble that Donald Trump has lived in for years is collapsing around him. The agents, who are professionals bound by duty, now have the awkward task of enforcing the new reality on the man they are sworn to protect. They have to tell him where he can't go, what he can't do, and who he can't speak to on official channels. It is a tense dynamic. These agents are often the closest people to a president, the ones who see him in his most unguarded moments. Now, they are the tangible face of the removal order, the ones who have to physically facilitate his departure from the complex. This brings us to the key actors who are managing this exit. While the Senate leaders signed the order, the execution falls on the shoulders of the White House counsel and the Chief of Staff. These are the people who have to walk into the Oval Office or the residence and deliver the news that it is time to leave. I am hearing that the White House counsel has been in nonstop communication with the Department of Justice to ensure that the terms of the departure are followed to the letter. There is a fear, valid or not, that any resistance could lead to a constitutional crisis where federal marshals have to get involved. Nobody wants that image. It would be a stain on the nation. So, the council is playing the role of the mediator, trying to convince the former president that a dignified, if forced, exit is his only remaining play. They are negotiating the logistics, how he leaves, when the helicopter lifts off, what personal staff he can take with him. It is a negotiation over the scraps of power that remain. You, the viewer, need to understand that this is not just about punishing a politician, it is about preserving the institution. If a president could ignore a removal order, if he could stay in the building and keep issuing commands, the entire concept of the rule of law would evaporate. The mechanisms we are seeing right now, the deactivation of codes, the revocation of passes, the reassignment of Secret Service, are the immune system of the democracy kicking in. It is messy to watch. It feels unstable. But this is actually the system working exactly as it was written to. It is the supremacy of the law over the man. I know many of you are worried about what comes next, about the anger this will generate in the country. That is a real concern, but consider the alternative. Consider a world where that signature meant nothing. That would be the true end of the experiment. We also need to talk about the role of the media in this specific hour. The networks are currently broadcasting live shots of the White House waiting for movement. But the real story is happening in the encrypted group chats of the staffers who are being ejected. They are leaking. They are trying to spin the narrative of their own exit. Some are claiming they were the ones holding the line against chaos. Others are blaming the legal team for failing them. We are seeing the fracturing of the loyalty that held this administration together. When the power dissolves, the fear of retribution dissolves with it. People start talking. And what they are saying paints a picture of a White House that was in denial until the very last second. They really believed they could bluff their way through a constitutional removal. They thought the Senate would blink. Now that the bluff has been called, the finger-pointing has begun. This is the circular firing squad that often forms at the end of a failed campaign, but this time it is happening inside the seat of government. As we look at the wider consequences, we have to acknowledge the human element of this machine. The thousands of political appointees who serve at the pleasure of the president are effectively fired the moment that signature lands. These are people with families, mortgages, and careers that are now in limbo. They are clearing their desks in the Eisenhower Executive Office building right now, wondering if they will ever work in this town again. The toxicity of this removal radiates outward. It marks everyone who is part of the inner circle. In Washington, your proximity to power is your currency. But right now, proximity to this specific administration is a liability. We are seeing a purge, not by a dictator, but by the statute. It is a mass casualty event for a specific political class, and the resentment that is breeding in those hallways tonight will fuel the political opposition for years to come. This is not the end of the conflict, it is the seeding of the next one. But before we get to the future, we have to look at the immediate fallout for the party and the voters who feel disenfranchised by this act. Because if you think the Senate's signature ended the argument, you haven't been paying attention to the mood of the country.